What's the scariest thing you have witnessed with your own eyes? Story 1. I saw a semi-truck start barreling down the grass median on an interstate highway in Florida, which at first struck me as unusual until they started driving into oncoming traffic. We were in a Jeep, so we drove far off the side of the highway in the grass just as the truck hit a Toyota in front of us and then crashed into one of the pilings on an overpass. The truck driver died instantly. I tried to work the other man free, but he was pinned in tightly and he died within a couple of minutes. They probably slept through the whole event. The Toyota had 4 college students driving home for Thanksgiving. I went to check on them after the truck driver died. It looked like the driver swerved away, so the truck hit his side, immediately killing him and the passenger behind him. The other 2 did not appear to be hurt but were in shock. My friend and I kept the other 2 talking until the emergency medical technicians arrived. Story 2. My friends and I were climbing up and jumping off a partially collapsed dam. The side with deep water was probably a 15-foot drop, and you had to climb up the slick concrete to jump off again. The left half of the dam was whole, and you could walk along the top. The right half was collapsed and had about an inch of water over it. The collapsed part was rubble with rebar and all kinds of sharp metal sticking out. I was climbing on the corner, partially over water and partially over the collapsed part, when I slipped about 1 foot from the top. One of my friends on the top grabbed the back of my life jacket at the last second and held me. For a few seconds, I was fully suspended over a 60-foot drop with dangerous debris at the bottom. I managed to get a hold of the dam wall again and climb back up. I owe that man my life. Story 3. Just this past Saturday, I went to the local bar to get some carryout and a growler. I saw a friend outside and talked for maybe 3 minutes when another man took a step, tripped, and fell hard into a stepped area of concrete. In the blink of an eye, this man was within minutes of dying. He began convulsing and vomiting uncontrollably, could not speak, and was bleeding heavily from his head, nose, and ears. He hit so hard that his nose was severely damaged and his skull was opened across his forehead. Emergency medical technicians were stunned and got him out of there as fast as possible. The bartender came out and washed more blood and vomit than I had ever seen from the pavement with buckets of hot bleach water. The scariest part was the speed at which this happened. People were standing so close to this man, but he went down so fast and hard that there was not time to react and catch him. The force of the impact was shocking. Story 4. My stepdad ended his life next to his plow truck while my mom watched. I was not there at the time, but immediately after it happened, my mom called me in a complete panic. By the time I arrived, the police had already taken the body, but the windshield and front corner panel were covered in biological material. My mom rode to the hospital having a severe anxiety episode, and I stayed to clean up. I drove his pickup into town, brought it to the car wash I had been to many times over the years, and washed it down. After delivering my stepdad's truck back to my mom's house and pushing the marked trail in the snow into a mound, I rode to the hospital in my car to see how my mom was. She was pretty loopy. They gave her something, and I remember feeling comforted by that, hoping she would maybe forget part of the trauma she had witnessed. I stayed a while but eventually decided to head out, figuring I would stop at my mom's one last time on the way to make sure I did not miss anything. I really did not want her to come home to anything more than she had to. My inspection of the immediate area looked good, with the exception of some strange-looking thing on the same side of the house. The side of the house where he had ended his life had a fenced area for my mom's pups, and the mystery object was directly above a large homemade doghouse. I walked through the house, entered the side yard, climbed onto the doghouse and pulled the white object off the siding. Had the surface been facing away from the wall, I would have recognized immediately what it was, but I did not. I grabbed it and turned it in my hand before the colored center faced upward. My heart sank, and the feeling made me physically ill. My guess is that the force of the incident propelled it outward at high speed. I threw the frozen object into the field, got back in my car, and drove home to get drunk. Story 5. I was with my mom at McDonald's when I was about 8 years old. We had just pulled up in the parking lot. A man came out dragging his son by the collar, and the boy looked about 13 or 14 years old. He was also crying. The man grabbed the boy by the throat and slammed his head against the wall. I distinctly remember the boy's choked off screaming. The man pinned him against the wall and hit him with a closed fist. My mom immediately called 911 and stepped out of the car to yell at the man, telling him to stop. He called her a rude name and told her to mind her own business. The police came quickly. They interviewed me and my mom, then the boy and his father. Then they let the man go home with his boy. The police said they did not see anything, so they could not prove anything. I remember being frantic and terrified. I begged them to stop the man from driving away. They ignored me, got in their car, and left. It was the most scared I had ever been up until that moment. Watching the police drive away in the black pickup with the dad and his son drive away as well. I will never forget that kid or how scared I was seeing him hurt and then seeing people just let him get hurt more. Story 6. I have not had the most adventurous life, but I remember one time when we were camping and my family was hiking around on this big rock while the sky started getting cloudy. My dad and siblings climbed up to the top of the rock, but my mom and I decided it was too steep for us. My dad reached up into the air and said he could feel static on his fingers. My little sister's hair started standing up a little, and my dad was just standing there with my brother, laughing at the staticky feeling he got when he reached up. My mom and I tried to convince him to come down, but he would not. Eventually he ended up getting down and no one was hurt, but I was terrified watching my little sister's hair stand up and my dad not doing anything about it. He is a good dad, but sometimes he can be a moron. He did not think the situation was that serious, even with my mom and me freaking out. Story 7. I saw a head-on collision between two SUVs on a remote section of road near Jasper, approximately 100 kilometers from the closest hospital. I was first on the scene, pulled people from burning vehicles after breaking windows, and my shirt caught on fire pulling people out. I attempted CPR with 2 other people on 4 of the 6 individuals until they passed away in our arms. Their bodies were severely damaged or CPR was not possible due to serious facial injuries and breathing trauma. One man kept reaching up to me asking if he was going to die and saying he could not breathe, but his lungs were clearly injured, and I breathed for him until he passed away. I told him he was loved and was with people who cared for him. The vehicles caught on fire, causing a fire in the forest around us, and it had to be put out with a helicopter hours later. During the hour it took for emergency services to arrive, a bear walked through the scene, and we had to constantly scare it away, probably due to the strong smell. I watched 2 people trapped in the fire because I could not reach them, even though I tried. I was covered in blood, body fluids, debris, and a tooth stuck in my knee. There was a baby laying face down on the road, and it was placed on who I thought was the mother while we did CPR. In the end, the baby and the mother were the only ones of all 8 who lived. So many lives were changed forever that day. I still have post-traumatic stress from the experience. I often feel like I failed at saving people, but their bodies were so severely damaged. Smells, sounds, and textures were all so vivid that I still get flashbacks and I am emotional writing this. Since then, I have had many horrifying dreams. But the dreams that stand out most are the ones where I meet the people who passed. In the dreams, they tell me positive words of encouragement and appreciation, even laughs and light jokes about life. It is strange. Please drive safe and care for each other. I tried everything I could do to help, and I truly did everything I could. Story 8. A man in the cell near me had a severe mental breakdown and harmed himself by repeatedly throwing himself into the walls and the door. The breakdown was not gradual at all. He began citing scripture and then suddenly started talking about his partner and what he believed she was doing while he was in there. He talked about someone he cared about being hurt and said repeatedly that he was going to do something dangerous or reckless. He then spread waste across the floor and covered himself and his cell with it. It was intense because nobody else locked up could help him, and the correctional officers did not seem to show urgency. They took a long time to respond, and by the time they arrived, he was limp, and the entire situation was horrible. I still hear him scream sometimes late at night, and if I am having vivid dreams, he will appear, either his voice or his wild hair. His cries were awful, and even when he was aware, you could tell he was struggling with overwhelming pain and anger. It is frightening to stand near someone who seems totally fine, and then shortly afterward, watch them completely change due to mental distress. The staff treated him harshly, and it was disturbing. Being locked up definitely holds some of the darkest memories. Story 9. My cousin was attacked by a Rottweiler. We had a neighbor who was 14 and had a Rottweiler tied up in their backyard, and we always thought it was friendly. We would hang out with our neighbor often. One particular time, my neighbor's sister was feeding and playing with the dog. My cousin, who was 8, and his twin brother went over to join her. One of them got on the doghouse, and the dog did not seem to like that, so it latched onto my cousin's thigh. He jumped down and tried to run away, but the dog pushed him down and grabbed his head and started shaking him. I was in shock and could not move, and it took me a moment to understand what was happening. It felt like watching everything in slow motion, his head being pulled back and forth and blood appearing everywhere. I snapped out of it when I saw my neighbor run toward them and start hitting the dog. The dog let go, and my cousin took off, running and screaming that he had a hole in his head. I ran to him and tried to calm him down. His scalp was hanging, and I could see the white of his skull. We lived next to my parents' restaurant, and the parking lot was full of customers. I called 911, and the ambulance arrived within minutes. He was taken to the hospital and had to have his scalp stapled and stitches on his chest and thigh. He was scared of dogs for a long time after that. Story 10. My mother is a beautiful human inside and out. She is very loving and kind, and although she is not perfect, she raised me very well. I love her deeply, and she was, and still is, my best friend. That being said, when I was around 6 years old, and I am currently 25, her ex-boyfriend was struggling with addiction and alcohol. He used to get very jealous of my mother because she made more money than him. He was living with us at the time, all 3 of us together. One night he came home under the influence of coca. He became angry with my mother, and I heard the yelling, so I went to their room to see what was happening. I saw him get angry and throw her computer. I later learned the argument started because he was jealous of her. He threw the computer down, and I started crying uncontrollably because that computer belonged to me and my mom. She used to play little online games with me when it was just us living together in a small studio apartment, and I miss those days. The computer had sentimental value for that exact reason. This is when the most traumatizing part happened. Before I describe it, my mother had to remind me this happened multiple times because it felt like I blacked out when I saw it. I remember everything vividly except this moment. He grabbed a knife, pinned her against a wall, and held it to her neck. Even though I felt like I blacked out, I still remember it in slow motion. The first woman I ever loved, the woman I would protect with my last breath, the woman who deserves the whole world, my mother, had a knife held to her neck, and I think back now and wish I could have done something. I was a scared 7-year-old. Our neighbors, who are still good friends today, came to help us. They opened our apartment door, and as soon as he saw them, he let go of the knife. We ended up sleeping at their house for the night. I do not know where this man is now, but I still have dark thoughts about what I would do if I ever saw him again, and I try not to think about it too much. Story 11. Back in the mid-1970s, I worked for a company called Triform Corporation in Gurnee, Illinois. I worked in the machine shop on day shift and usually went in early so I could have a smoke and a cup of coffee before starting work. I worked on a turret lathe mostly. There was a woman who ran that turret lathe on third shift, so I always took over from her. I did not know her very well, just knew that she was pretty and had long, silky hair. One morning I heard a scream, and then people scrambling and shouting. I ran over to the source of the noise. It was that woman. Her long hair had gotten tangled on the piece of bar stock she had been working with. It grabbed her hair and tore her scalp, peeling from the back of her head to the tip of her nose. When I got there, it was still spinning around. I will never forget the horrible sound it made. I hit the emergency stop. Somebody had grabbed towels and wrapped her head and was trying to keep her calm, but she was hysterical. It was very bad. Story 12. This happened around 15 years ago. I was visiting El Salvador with my family and a longtime friend of over 30 years. One day we went to a coastline and thought it was a great place to fish because we could see for miles, and my friend was a well-experienced diver and boater. I was feeling really tired that day, so I went to sleep. I woke up and realized I had dozed off too long because it was around 6 in the evening and dark. I looked around the house we rented for the week and realized I was the only one there. My family and friend were gone, So I waited one more hour and then felt a wave of dread. I ran out to where I had last seen them. As I ran down the street, I saw a large group of people gathering at the coast and found out my kids were stranded near the shoreline with people throwing things to them to hold on to. My wife was crying and yelling, and I helped some men pull them to safety. Then I realized that my friend and the boat were missing. I looked at the coastline one last time and heard him yelling that he was sorry and that he did his best. I saw my friend go down into the ocean with the boat flipping over him and drowning him. He had swum for 3 hours in rough water with my kids, bringing them as close to the coast as he could before collapsing from exhaustion, still believing he had not done enough. Story 13. This was in October 2019. The story takes a little setup, so bear with me. I work as a volunteer corner marshal with the Sports Car Club of America San Francisco region and have since 2005. That particular weekend, I was at a corner with the president of the Sports Car Club of America, who was there to observe. From my corner post, I could see where the emergency crew was staged. During what was to be the second to last race before lunch, a car pulled off course where the emergency team was staged with mechanical trouble, which is a good place to be if your car breaks down, because they do not have to come get you. It was the last lap, and one of the emergency crew members, who was also a friend of mine, was on the right side of the car talking to the driver, presumably giving him instructions for when they towed him in. Around this time, I saw a car sliding through the grass at a high speed toward the emergency station. I keyed up on my headset and shouted, "Heads up, emergency!" And at that moment, the sliding race car hit the disabled car broadside, pinning the emergency crew member between them. The only member of that crew who heard me was their dispatcher, because the rest were communicating with him via radio. I immediately began reporting the incident to race control. As soon as the dust cleared, other members of the emergency crew, along with paramedics, rushed around the man who was hit. At first, I thought it was someone else until I noticed the man lying on the ground was wearing red suspenders. Then I knew who it was, and my heart sank. This was the third major trauma he had suffered while working a race. We broke for lunch early. I was shaken up from the incident and cried during the lunch break. Though I did pick up some food even though I was not hungry, it was probably a year and a half before I finally stopped having flashbacks of the incident. As for my friend, he survived, but it has been a long road to recovery, and he is still on that road. He has not worked a race since then, but he visits occasionally. Story 14. My wife and I went to a farm about an hour from our house to pick strawberries. We had a 2-year-old son at the time, but we knew with everything going on we would be busy and have a hard time controlling him, so we asked my mother-in-law to watch him. We picked our more than 20 pounds of fresh strawberries and kept seeing this one little girl about our son's age running through the fields and having a great time eating all the fresh strawberries she could. We even thought that maybe we should have brought him with us. Then we rode back from the fields on a hay wagon, and the girl and her mother were on the wagon with us. I told my wife I would put the berries in the car, and then we would check out their market. I walked out into the small field where we were parked, and I did not think much about seeing the little girl's mother parked next to us bringing her berries out, until I noticed her daughter was not with her. That is when I heard her yell, "Oh my God, they ran over my daughter!" I turned and saw a Mercury Mariner stopped in the middle of the lane through the parking field, and I could see a little blonde head underneath. I sprinted over and crawled under the car. Thankfully, the little girl had been knocked down, and the car had just passed over her. She had a 1st to 2nd degree burn on her back because the catalytic converter had been on top of her when I crawled under the vehicle. As I was trying to make sure we could keep her still, her mother grabbed her by the arm and pulled her out. To the best of my knowledge, she ended up being medically okay because a doctor was present and they called an ambulance. But I was not okay. I had small anxiety attacks every time we walked through a parking lot for a long time afterward and made sure I was the one holding our son's hand. All I could see when I jumped under that car was my own child. Story 15. Many years ago, I was driving over an overpass in the dead of winter. It was coated with slick ice, but I did not know that until it was too late. I was in the right lane, and a large LTD was slowly passing me on the left. We were traveling about 55 miles per hour. My baby daughter was sleeping in her car seat in the back. Just as we reached the top of the overpass, there was a large roll of fiberglass insulation lying in the middle of our lanes. Just beyond that, a pickup truck came into view, parked on the right side median, and the road was covered with maybe 10 more rolls of insulation. The pickup driver was walking into the middle of the lanes to pick up his lost cargo. He was about 200 feet in front of us. I gently touched the brakes and immediately realized there was no way I was going to stop. So I took my foot off the brake pedal and quickly began calculating how I could steer through the obstacle course without losing control. The driver of the LTD did not react the same way. He apparently slammed on his brakes and immediately lost control on the icy bridge. When I glanced left to see what he was doing, his car was facing directly at me, and he was clutching the steering wheel and screaming. He was now going 55 miles per hour sideways down the highway. The driver of the pickup realized he was in a very dangerous spot and sprinted behind his parked truck. The pickup was parked about 3 feet to the right of the line of my right lane, and in my peripheral vision, I could see the large car on my left slowly drifting toward me while continuing to glide sideways. I was being squeezed between the two vehicles and had no way to stop and nowhere to go. All I could do was hold the wheel straight and hope the driver on my left would not force me and my baby girl into the parked pickup. It all happened in seconds. I managed to steer between them with almost no room to spare, and our vehicle was never touched. Once I cleared the pickup, I looked in my rearview mirror. The LTD hit the dry pavement, began spinning, flew across our lane, and crashed into the right side median. Numerous other vehicles were sliding down the overpass, spinning out of control, hitting the parked pickup, and crashing into each other like bumper cars. No one could stop, and drivers on the other side of the overpass had no idea what they were driving into. I read later that more than 20 vehicles were involved in the pileup, but thankfully no one was killed. I will never forget the look on the LTD driver's face. Pure fear. Story 16. I live in the downtown area of a mid-sized American city. My residence is above a bar in one of the busier nightlife areas of town, so it is not uncommon to hear people make a lot of noise at night, and I have witnessed hit-and-run incidents, screaming matches, and intense fights all from my modest balcony. I am also close to City Hall and several government buildings. In 2020, when protests were occurring, most of the local groups marched right past my building. They were peaceful, and I never saw them do anything destructive. I am a night owl, so I was awake one night after 2 in the morning, just after the bars had closed, when I heard shouting, which was not unusual because people leaving at last call are often loud. Protesters had marched earlier in the evening, but the people outside now were not carrying signs. They just seemed angry. As I watched, a group of about 15 to 20 people broke the windows and forced their way into the grocery store across the street and began taking items. Less than a minute later, the crowd scattered, and a police riot vehicle, which looked like an armored van, drove onto the sidewalk. A man burst out of the top of the vehicle and fired tear gas canisters at the fleeing looters, while officers in riot gear spread out to detain the people they could reach. I could only see so much from my balcony, but I heard breaking glass and yelling for the next 20 to 30 minutes before everything calmed down. I could not sleep afterward. I was not worried about anyone breaking into my place, but I kept thinking someone might run inside and pull the fire alarm. The whole situation put me on edge. The next day, nearly all the businesses in my 4-block area either had broken windows or were boarding up as a precaution. What upset me most was that local media reported it as protest-related violence, even though, from what I saw, the looters had nothing to do with the peaceful group that had marched hours earlier. Story 17. I was a skydiving instructor for a couple of years. There was a very confident kid who went through our program and was not great at listening, barely qualified for the solo jump phase, and so on. I did not have the authority to remove him from the program, and I was not close enough to the situation to know if they were wrong in allowing him to continue. On his first jump, he had a poor free fall, which was not unusual, but his canopy work was not terrible. I saw his second jump, where he ignored radio instructions under canopy and turned without looking, causing his parachute to wrap around another student, obstructing that student's vision and movement. At this point, with the first kid hanging by a collapsed canopy wrapped around the second student about 1,000 feet off the ground, the proper response is to ride it down since neither is falling dangerously fast. But instead of following instructions or the advice given to him over the radio, he cut away his first parachute, went back into free fall, and waited for his reserve to deploy. Watching from the tower that day, I thought I would witness a disaster. Fortunately, we had some of the best riggers in the country working for us, and the reserve deployed immediately. As soon as it fully opened, he touched down. He could not have cut it any closer. Needless to say, he did not get to jump again. Story 18. This is my mom's story, and the way she tells it always chills me. It was her senior year of high school, and she was at one of the last football games of the season. She was laughing with friends and cheering for her team. It was a great night. A player from the other team tackled a boy from her school, a popular kid. Everyone saw it, and nobody thought anything unusual when he fell. The whistle blew, the play ended, and the boy remained on the ground. Some people laughed because they thought he was joking, and a coach went on to the field with water. He bent down to check on the kid, then signaled for other coaches and more people to come over. Nobody was laughing after a few minutes. It became clear what had happened, but it felt unreal and people did not know what to say. My mom said it was one of the worst nights of her life. She got her parents to pick her up, and by the time they arrived, there were police and an ambulance on the field. She said it was frightening and eerie because they left the body there in full view as people moved around. It was even more unsettling because the bands kept playing. According to her, he had some sort of hidden condition that was triggered by the tackle. It was a terrible way to end her senior year, and she has never forgotten it. Story 19. Back in my childhood, my grandfather lived with us, and my sister and I were always asking him for money for things like stationery, books, chips, and candy. For some reason, he always took her side and gave her money, and as a child, I thought he disliked me. So I started sneaking into his room and taking small amounts from his wallet just to annoy him and buy my own things. One day when he was sleeping, I went into his room and took some money, and as I was leaving, he called me to sit beside him. I knew he had seen everything. To my surprise, he did not punish me. Instead, he said that he knew I always thought he favored my sister. He told me he loved me and that I was better than stealing. He said he came from a generation where boys helped their siblings and family, and he told me to study hard and make everyone proud. He said he did not know how to show his love, but that I would understand after he was gone. Then he held my hand and asked me to sing his favorite song, and as the song ended, so did his life. I sat there holding his hand, his eyes filled with tears and a gentle smile on his face. After his funeral, I found out he had never given me money because he was putting it into a bank account so my sister and I could go to college. Later, I learned he made me the next owner of his account. The bank manager told me he had been one of their oldest employees for 50 or 60 years and had arranged everything long ago. That day, I realized people are not always what they appear to be, and I wished I could have thanked him, but it was too late. Story 20. My dad owned a business that worked in the oil field industry, transporting sand to hydraulic fracturing sites. Sometimes, if he did not have enough trucks to meet demand, he hired a driver from another company. The men he hired were often questionable, and this was about 6 months before electronic logging devices became mandatory. I was headed to Enid, Oklahoma to help coordinate one of these jobs when my dad called and said one of the contracted drivers told him he had been in an accident. I was about 10 to 15 miles from where he said he was, so I told my dad I would go take pictures for insurance purposes. If you are not familiar, the roads on the west side of Oklahoma are usually very empty at night. I arrived to find the driver standing behind his truck, talking nonstop on his phone, clearly under the influence of what turned out to be methamphetamine. When I walked to the front of the truck, I saw he had run a four-way stop and hit a van. There were 6 people in the van, and all but the baby in the car seat had passed away. He had not even called the police. He was talking to his girlfriend. I called 911, got the baby out of the vehicle, checked the rest of the family for pulses and found none, and waited for the authorities. I will never forget how quiet it was or how unreal it felt to check for signs of life on 3 children while not knowing what to do with a silent baby who was just looking around. The driver went to prison, and I never went out on a job for my dad's company again. My mind has turned the memory into something that feels like a movie, but it remains the most horrifying thing I have ever seen. Story 21. After leaving the military and while studying at university, I worked in war zones and natural disasters, handling risk management and logistics for different clients such as media, non-governmental organizations, mining, and manufacturing. We spent about 6 weeks in an Iraqi city, that had deteriorated badly. And a few times a week at different, irregular times, we visited a local bakery to pick up flatbread to break up the monotony of our rations. On our last day before flying back home, we stopped at the bakery to get bread and say goodbye to the man and his family, who had always been kind and welcoming. We left him with about 100 United States dollars, which he greatly appreciated. Less than 1 minute after we got into the armored vehicles and left, we felt and heard a small but distinct thump and pressure wave. Frantic voices came over the radio, and our interpreter became upset. An ISIS Suic bomber had detonated his vest inside the bakery we had just left. We got out of the area immediately, but the thought of that man and his family being killed, likely because ISIS was targeting us, haunts me to this day. It was terrifying and heartbreaking. Story 22. My dad suffered heart failure and was clinically dead for several minutes before paramedics revived him with an adrenaline shot to the heart, but his brain had been without oxygen for so long that he was functionally brain dead. When I arrived at the hospital, he was in a bed on a respirator, his eyes wide open and his face shifting through various expressions that meant nothing, just nerves firing as his body slowly shut down. His hands were secured to the bed to prevent full posturing, but they still lifted about 6 inches up and down, his fingers opening and closing while his head rolled from side to side and his face kept changing. It was the first time I had seen him in 6 years, adding an even more surreal layer to the feeling of watching what looked like real expressions on his face. The nurse had to shine a flashlight in his eye so I could see his pupils not react and accept that he was not responding to anything. His organs were failing, so thankfully it lasted hours instead of weeks or months or years, and as the end approached, the movements became smaller. But seeing any person, let alone your father, in that state is disturbing, and a vivid reminder that we are all just bodies made of tissue and bone, and none of us escapes mortality. Story 23. My uncle does not have a Reddit account, but when I told him about this post he wanted to share, so he spoke, and I typed. He is a train conductor for a large freight company in North America, Union Pacific. He said, my buddy Stokes and I were hauling down a stretch of track between Elko and Ogden. Another train going the same direction was about 20 miles ahead of us and radioed in that there was a woman wandering near the right-of-way and acting suspicious. It was 2 a.m. in the middle of the high desert, so it was odd but not impossible. As we approached the area they mentioned, we saw a small sedan parked by the tracks, looking abandoned. About a mile past the car, there was a bend in the tracks with thick shrubs on the left side. As we entered the curve, a figure stepped out from the shrubs and walked directly onto the tracks. It all happened in about 10 seconds. When we struck her, there was not even a slight movement or sound. Our train took half a mile to stop because we had empty cars. The remains from a person being hit by a fast freight train looked like pieces of meat and scraps of clothing. Later, they discovered she had been suicidal, had attempted an overdose, and after surviving that, decided the rails were her next option. She was only in her 20s, which was heartbreaking. The strange part was that the train ahead of us said they never saw a car, and that the woman they saw looked clearly Latina, while the woman we struck was white. That is my uncle's story. Please do not mess around near trains. They are huge, fast, made of steel, and humans are fragile by comparison. Story 24. I was 7 years old, currently 25, and living in Bay Harbor, a small town in Miami, Florida. Serious crime was rare in that neighborhood, but back then it was much more common. I remember playing outside with my friend Andrea, and we were upstairs on the patio balcony area just talking. Suddenly we heard a woman scream for her life. We saw her appear from around a corner with another panicked shout, and her hair was being pulled from behind. As she struggled, a man wearing navy blue work pants and a navy blue shirt stepped into view. He looked like he worked a low-level job, maybe a plumber or janitor. He was bald with horseshoe-style hair, tan, and had black hair on the sides. He was trying to pull her by the hair while she fought to get away. She finally broke free and ran. The scariest part was that the man saw me reacting, shocked by what he was doing. It was just me and Andrea outside, so no one else witnessed it. As I stared in fear, he looked up at me from below with a cold, threatening expression, like he could come up to the balcony and harm me. Andrea and I ran into our apartments, and that was the end of it. Sometimes I feel guilty thinking about it. I do not know what happened to the woman, and I feel like maybe I could have done something, though I was just a 7-year-old kid. Part of me hopes that because he saw us watching, it startled him and gave her the chance she needed to escape. I hope she is doing well now. Story 25. There is a place called the Snail Parking Lot downtown where I live. It is a 5-floor building used only for parking, and it spirals upward, which is how it got the name. From the outside, you can see the cars inside because the walls on each floor are only about 1 meter high, and there are no windows. I was driving with 3 friends one evening around 8, already dark outside. On the way there, we noticed the 4th floor was completely black. Floors 1, 2, and 3 looked normal, lit by long fluorescent bulbs, and the 5th floor also seemed to be lit. But for some reason, the 4th floor's lights were off. It was normal for them not to turn on the top floors until needed, but the 4th being dark while the 5th was on was strange. We did not think much of it and continued. We parked on the 3rd floor. When we got out and walked toward the stairs, we noticed the stairs going up had a makeshift barricade at the entrance. It was a fence held in place with heavy chains and locks, with a couple of wooden boards wired across it. On the boards, there were nails holding a notice about the 4th floor being foreclosed. It did not say why. It made it even stranger that the 5th floor lights were still on. We decided to take the elevator instead of the stairs because my 3 friends were female and one of them was pregnant. We stepped into the elevator, pressed 0 to go down, the doors closed, and then the elevator stayed still. It would not move, would not open, and the emergency button did not activate the light or make any sound. After some time, the elevator lights went off. My friends were panicking while I tried to calm them down, and then the elevator started moving, but it was going up. After a few seconds, the doors opened on the 4th floor. That is when things became strange. We stepped out, trying to use our phones for light. We were sweating and overheated from being stuck inside. I suggested we walk toward the barricade to see if someone could hear us and notify management. Then something started making a low, deep growling sound, like a rough exhale. We heard chains dragging across the floor. At first I thought someone came because we had pressed the elevator panic button, but I quickly realized it was too fast for anyone to climb the stairs and get there. Our phones barely illuminated 2 meters ahead, and I felt a wave of trembling rising from my legs up my spine. We heard steps along with the chains getting closer. I whispered that we should get back in the elevator without even knowing why. My friends followed, and one started panic pressing the close doors button as the steps grew faster. The doors finally began closing, just as we saw the outline of a large, hunched figure running toward us. I could not see details, though one friend insisted it had no eyes, only empty sockets. Once the doors closed, the elevator moved up to the 5th floor without us pressing anything. The doors opened to an empty area, at least with working lights. The stairs going down to the 4th floor also had a barricade, but it seemed to be built from the 4th floor side, with the foreclosure notice facing the 5th floor, which made even less sense because no one should have reached the 5th floor without passing through the 4th. The elevator doors stayed open, and we walked about 15 meters away. We started calling people to see if anyone nearby could go tell someone to get us out. We did not mention what we saw because we did not want to sound crazy and risk someone hanging up. Out of nowhere, we heard someone behind us say, "What are you doing here?" We turned around startled, and there was a man dressed like a construction worker staring blankly at us. We tried explaining, relieved someone was there, but he cut us off and repeated the same question. "What are you doing here?" We stayed quiet, and I said, "We just want to go down." After a moment, he said in a menacing tone, "Leave," and pointed at the elevator. We walked in, and without pressing anything, the doors closed and the elevator went to the bottom floor. We ran to the small front office where the building manager usually is. I started saying, "Hey, we were just in the elevator," and he cut me off immediately with, "I know, I will take care of it," then closed the sliding panel he was speaking through. We realized there was nothing else we could do and continued with our plans downtown. But we definitely used the stairs to get back to my car when we left. Story 26, I was jailed in Saidnaya prison for 3 months during my army service in Syria for assaulting a higher rank. In that prison, people cannot see the sun or leave their dorms. Each dorm could fit around 20 people at most, but there were at least 35 in each one. Most prisoners had no idea why they were there or what they had done to deserve it. The prison provided no food, and if you wanted to eat, you had to pay for it. Prisoners could order canned food and cigarettes once every 2 weeks, and they received money from their families during visits that happened only once a month. Many families did not even know their relatives were imprisoned. It was terrible and inhumane. One day I had a fight with another inmate in my dorm, and we were both sent to individual cells, dark, wet rooms without beds. I overheard two inmates talking through the walls, just a normal conversation about where they were from, how long they had been there, and what they had done. Prisoners there used months as a counter, so instead of saying 2 years, they said 24, and they did not even say the word months. Everyone understood it by default. The first man said he had been there for 14, and the second said 38. As they talked, the second man laughed and said, "Oh, you meant 14 months. I thought 14 years." The first man broke into tears. I got goosebumps and could not help crying too. He had no idea why he was there, never had a court hearing, was never questioned, and his family did not know whether he was alive or dead. Later, after I was released, I researched it. Apparently, the Syrian government used to imprison anyone who posed or could pose a potential threat to the ruling family, even based purely on assumptions. That was in 2009. After the war began in 2011, they would simply execute such people on the spot. Story 27. On November 3rd, 2012, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment with my girlfriend. One night, I was standing out back smoking a cigarette. Behind the apartment was a row of trees that lined the road behind it. It was only a 2-lane road, semi-busy during the day, but around 8 in the evening it was quiet. I heard a car speeding down the road, easily doing 100 miles per hour. It passed by in about 2 seconds. A moment later, I heard the loudest bang I had ever heard. I ran inside and told my girlfriend to put on shoes because there had been an accident. We got in the car and drove the short distance, maybe 1/8 of a mile. When we arrived, we saw a convertible BMW 3 Series that had crashed head-on into a Suburban. By then, the car was already smoldering and starting to catch fire. Gasoline was everywhere. The driver was slumped over, lightly bleeding, clearly gone on impact. One bystander helped me try to get him out. We tried opening the door, but convertibles have less rigid structures, and the impact had pushed the door into the rear of the car. I reached over the man and unbuckled his seatbelt as the fire grew. We grabbed him by the arms and torso to pull him out. But when I looked into the footwell, I saw it was crushed along with his legs. The car had folded into an L shape, with the engine forming the short part and the cabin the long part. His legs were trapped. We tried pulling him out for what felt like several minutes, but was likely less than 1 or 2. We managed to get the upper part of his body through the window when the fire intensified and the car burst into flames. We had no choice but to step back. Fire crews arrived shortly after and took over. When I turned around, I saw cars lining both sides of the street, people watching and recording, which made me feel worse than the accident itself. Back at the apartment, I changed clothes and found the man's blood on every item I had worn: shoes, socks, sweatpants, boxers, hoodie, and shirt. The soles of my shoes had begun to dissolve from the gasoline. Later, we learned the driver had just recently turned 18. Story 28. In 2017, when I was around 12 or 13, my island was completely destroyed by Hurricane Irma. It was the strongest Atlantic storm ever recorded and essentially added an extra 2 levels to the hurricane scale, which normally only goes up to 5, but Irma was estimated to be around a 7. I was just a kid and had lived through hurricanes before with relative ease, but this one was different. I only remember a few vivid snapshots from the day. I remember water literally raining on me through the top of my door frame from the sheer force of the wind. I remember the metal locks on the doors to my porch snapping off one by one. I remember bracing myself against a reinforced glass door to keep it closed, then running into a small office in the house and seeing that the glass had exploded when I came back out. Most of all, I remember looking up and seeing a huge section of the roof was gone. My parents and I hid in that office for what felt like a lifetime until the eye passed over. When we came out, we realized our whole life had been destroyed, with glass, dishes, and wood scattered everywhere. One of my most vivid memories happened during the eye when we were trying to find dry clothes to go to a neighbor's house. I had filled a black plastic bag with clothes beforehand, but it was trapped under rubble and I could not get it out. I was searching desperately for something to open it when I looked into the middle of my room and saw a penknife I had been given for Christmas. It was lying exactly in the center of the floor and somehow already opened. In all the chaos, it had placed itself exactly where and how I needed it. It felt like something was telling me I would be okay, and it gave me strength when I needed it most. The strangest part was seeing the island afterward. There was no power, no outside communication, and no running water for months. It was surreal to realize none of my friends had been affected in the same way, and most just played board games with their families while my home was destroyed. Even so, that event became a major turning point in my life, and I would not be who I am today without it. Story 29. In the last house I owned, we had a long hallway that led to the kitchen and living room. We spent most of our time in the living room, walking back and forth through the hallway throughout the day. Late one night, after putting the kids to bed, I was cleaning up before going to sleep. I had walked past that hallway many times and always got an uneasy feeling. That night, out of the corner of my eye, I saw what looked like the silhouette of a person standing at the end of the dark hallway, right between the doors to my kids' rooms. I stepped back and it was still there, though less clear than the first moment I noticed it. I turned on the light and nothing was there. I turned it off again and the silhouette was gone completely. My wife had mentioned hearing footsteps going up and down the hallway several times. I had heard similar sounds but assumed it was the house settling. My kids' monitors sometimes picked up strange noises, and on a few occasions they woke up and talked to something before going back to sleep. There were also times when they woke up screaming in a way that sounded far more terrified than usual. Eventually we moved to another home, and we have not experienced anything unusual there. But I can say with certainty that we were relieved to sell that house. Story 30. When I was about 6 or 7 years old, I lived in a small neighborhood in West Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Just a couple blocks from my house, there was a small patch of woods where all the neighborhood kids played. We rode our bikes through the trails over little dirt ramps, through dips in the ground, and treated it like our own adventure park. Nearly every kid in the neighborhood hung out there, so it was never empty until the day this happened. My grandmother was visiting from out of the country and wanted to see me ride, and I was excited to show off my talents on the trails. It was late October, chilly, and the leaves were turning. When we arrived at the woods, I immediately noticed something strange. No one was there, completely empty. That had never happened before, but I shrugged it off. I rode a lap to show my grandma, who stood in the middle cheering me on. Then I suddenly felt uneasy. It was too quiet. I stopped riding and just stood there, this weird feeling crawling over me. That is when I saw it. Something walking in the trees on the far side of the woods. A black hooded figure. No face, just a head-to-toe black shape gliding between the trees. When it noticed me watching, it stepped back behind a tree, then slowly peeked out again. When it leaned out, there was still no face. Nothing. I bolted instantly, yelling for my grandma to run. I pedaled home as fast as I could, and yes, I left my grandma behind. I opened the garage, ran inside, slammed it down, grabbed my dad's golf club, and stood guard until I heard someone outside. I cracked the door open, ready to swing. Thankfully, it was her. She was shaken, but okay. I told her what I saw, and she said she had seen it too, and that it had started walking toward her. I never told anyone about this until now. Story 31. In the summer of 2017, my wife, her friend, and I were in an Uber heading to downtown Toronto for a birthday dinner. On Bayview Avenue near the Brickworks, a place anyone from the area knows is full of terrible drivers, we came across an accident. A car had tried to do a sudden U-turn right after coming off an off-ramp, and a motorcycle had slammed into the side of it. The driver was still in the car, and the motorcycle was rocking on the pavement. My wife, who is an experienced registered nurse, immediately became the first responder. She ran straight to the motorcyclist, yelling at the crowd to move back and asking if anyone could help. She was preparing to start CPR, but there was so much blood pouring from the rider's mouth that all she could do was compress her chest. I heard her tell another nurse who came running that the rider was already gone, but she kept trying for what felt like forever, though it was maybe 10 or 15 minutes until the EMTs arrived. During that time, I tried to push the crowd back and find anyone who knew the motorcyclist. A close friend of hers was there, having ridden with her, and he was sobbing in the trees while trying to call her family. The whole scene deeply affected my wife. I tend to hyper-focus during emergencies, so the emotional weight hit me later. When EMTs took over, my wife walked back to us, covered in another woman's blood, and insisted we get another Uber and go to the birthday dinner. At the party, she said 2 short sentences about what happened, made it clear no one was to ask her any questions, then got very drunk and tried to enjoy the night. In the week after, I intercepted calls from local news reporters who had somehow gotten her number. She refused to speak to the media, especially after talking to the motorcyclist's sister. Only recently has she been able to talk about the event outside that small circle. Story 32, I was about 12 years old on a Bible study trip with a friend when I saw a bicyclist flip over the hood of a car. The cyclist had been biking with his brother and came speeding down a hill toward the intersection where we were. He tried to squeeze his handbrakes, but they snapped because of his speed, and he was struck by a moving car. I watched him get thrown off his bike and over the hood. We pulled over, and because we were 12, we were told to stay in the car while the adults tried to stop his bleeding. He had broken most of his ribs and needed a helicopter to the nearest hospital. His brother came down the hill seconds later and saw him lying on the pavement bleeding. Miraculously, a few days later, we heard he was expected to make a full recovery, which was shocking given the stress his body went through. The strangest part was that we only witnessed it because we had turned back earlier when my friend's mother forgot her reading glasses, delaying us by about 10 minutes. If we had not turned around, we would have never seen it happen or been extra hands at the scene. The hardest part was being unable to help. Even as a 12-year-old, I wanted to do something but knew I could not. I am grateful he recovered, and I hope he is doing well now. He was only 17 at the time and had so much life left to experience. Story 33. When I was younger, I lived on a moderately rough side of Detroit. The house across the street from mine was clearly a drug house. They always had extremely fancy cars outside a rundown home, and people came and went at all hours. One day I was planting flowers with my mom when I noticed a red SUV stopped in the middle of the road outside the drug house and just sitting there. I watched for movement, but nothing happened, so I kept planting while still keeping an eye on it. About 5 or 10 minutes later, I saw a door open but no one got out. Then I looked toward the drug house and saw a man circling the front yard with a pistol in his hand. I froze. I could not believe what I was seeing with my own eyes. I stared so long that he noticed me, and we made eye contact, but he did nothing. A moment later, he spotted someone in the backyard and immediately started firing. The other guy shot back. A stray bullet hit a car in the driveway and caused a massive fire that nearly set 2 houses on fire, though thankfully they did not catch. No one was hurt, but it was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. Story 34. I was told not to tell scary stories, which surprised me because I had worse ones, but here is the one I shared. I lived in a bad neighborhood, but my friend lived in an even worse part of Chicago. We were watching one of the Faces of Death movies, though I do not remember which. Living on the streets in Chicago meant you saw wild things. Within the first 20 minutes of the movie, we heard a real car chase happening right outside, followed by a huge crash and finally an ambulance. We ended up turning the movie off because the real thing was unfolding outside. A small crowd gathered. A man was lying on the ground, shirt cut open, with tiny bleeding dots all over his chest, 22's bullet holes. What disturbed me most was one of the paramedics saying, "Why should we fix him? He will probably be shot again next week. Save time and let him die tonight." I felt this surge of anger. Yes, people get shot every day in Chicago, but why take the job if you are going to speak like that? The other paramedics ignored him. Thankfully, they focused on trying to help, but the kid was barely breathing. I do not know if he survived. He looked close to death. We used to do graffiti, and we knew gangs would shoot at you if they saw you. You either wrote for them or you did not. Story 35. I work in information technology at a small business, and my brother worked there too in another department. One day I was hooking something up under a coworker's desk when his manager suddenly started screaming my name. My first instinct was active shooter, so I sprinted toward her, only to see my brother leaning back in his chair, clenching and having a seizure. He looked like he was gasping, his eyes rolled back, completely unresponsive. One coworker was CPR certified, and she and two others helped get him onto the floor. He finally came to while I was mid-call with my mother, trying to ask what medication he was taking because the EMTs needed that information. He did not remember anything and was taken into the ambulance. The whole thing felt like it lasted 20 minutes, but in reality it happened in barely 2 minutes. The EMT station was only about a mile away, so they arrived incredibly fast. I remember trying to call my mom while he was still twitching, but my fingers would not cooperate. I knew exactly what I needed to dial, but my hands kept failing to do it, like my brain could not connect to my fingers. Once he was safe and on the way to the hospital, I broke down in the parking lot and went home for the day. We later learned he had a 5-year coca addiction that we had seen signs of but never fully recognized as that severe. The seizure had been induced by coca. He was fired soon after, God help, and has now been sober for over a year. It was the scariest thing I have ever witnessed. Story 36, I was an Army medic in Baghdad during the surge, on aid station duty one day at the Riva Ridge Treatment Center just south of Ghazalia, when a patrol came through the gate with several injured local civilians. One man had his right leg blown off below the knee, tied off with a tourniquet, but he was still bleeding from somewhere. He was screaming in Arabic while we cut off his clothes to locate the bleeding, but something in his clothing was tangled. As I cut downward, I saw it was wrapped in a wire, a green insulated copper wire, probably 14 gauge. One end was tangled in his clothes and the other end disappeared into his rectum. There were 2 other medics with me at the bedside, and when I lifted the wire, we all looked at each other because we immediately understood what it meant. This man had been stuffed with an explosive device and then purposely injured so that the bomb would be brought to us. The other medics nodded, and I closed my eyes and cut the wire, praying it was not like what you see in movies. Nothing happened. We removed the rest of his clothes, packed his bullet wounds with tampons, and wrapped him in blankets for transport to the hospital, with about 6 inches of green wire still hanging out of him. I have no idea what ultimately happened to him, but I swear part of my soul left my body that day. Story 37. I was driving to work about 15 years ago on a typical United Kingdom single-lane country road with traffic moving in both directions at around 60 miles per hour. I was about 50 meters behind a line of cars, following a large truck. Coming toward us was another column of traffic, and someone at the very back of that column decided to overtake, apparently believing they could slip back into their lane before reaching the cars in front of me. They were wrong. They reached our line of traffic before completing the pass, panicked, and swerved too early, clipping the lead car in their column and sending that driver, a woman traveling alone, straight into a ditch. The overtaking car then bounced off her car and careened back across the road directly into my lane. For a moment, I truly thought that was the end, an out-of-control car coming straight toward me at a combined speed of well over 100 miles per hour. At the last moment, the car clipped the very back corner of the truck in front of me, bounced away, hit the curb on its own side, flipped repeatedly in all directions, and landed upside down in the ditch. I pulled over, as did about a dozen others, and I was already on my phone calling emergency services. I did not want to look inside either car. The woman whose car had been hit first was out, storming toward the overturned car, screaming, "What were you thinking?" repeatedly before someone physically restrained her, which probably prevented her from attacking the driver. When others reached the overturned car, 3 young men crawled out with severe injuries, including multiple compound fractures and heavy bleeding. An air ambulance was dispatched. The nearest fire station was only a mile away and arrived quickly, and police took my information. I was later interviewed at home as a witness. The driver was convicted of dangerous driving, banned, and jailed. That was the day I realized how easily someone else's stupidity behind the wheel can end your life without warning.